Viewers, you should ask your parents what they paid for bubblegums like this when they grow up. Was it 5 cents? Or maybe your parents are not that old. It was probably a long time ago that bubblegum was priced at 5 cents. Was it 50 cents in their time perhaps? Or when you were little, did you pay $1 for them? And here you are, not yet quite an adult, although very nearly of course, and the chewing gum bowl costs $2. What do we call that? A mistake in shop calculations? A ripoff? Or maybe it's time to quit bubblegum? No. That phenomenon is called inflation, and you'll hear more about inflation in today's lesson for Economics Advanced Level Grade 12 learners. Thank you for joining us. This is Lesson 3 in our 5-part series for economics learners. We know that you have learned about inflation at least from grade 10, but we'll recap on the basics about inflation. After that, we'll discuss the causes of inflation and the consequences of inflation for consumers, workers, firms, and government. Inflation is defined as the persistent increase in general price levels. Prices rise at a particular rate, and this rate is then the inflation rate, or the rate of inflation. For instance, an inflation rate of 6% would mean that on average prices are 6% higher than in the previous period. And when the price level increases, the value of money falls, and its purchasing power becomes less. Each unit of the currency will buy less and less all the time. But why does this happen? What exactly causes inflation? The word inflation, if you take away the ION at the end, then it says inflate, meaning to rise, puff up, or grow, like a balloon. In most cases, products have become fewer and their quality have often not improved. But what has grown is their price. For the same sized apple or bubblegum, you started out paying 5 cents, then 10 cents, soon it was 50 cents, eventually $1. And before you know it, the same bubblegum now costs $2. You can see where it's heading next, perhaps $5. The amount of money in the economy and the value of items go up over time, and this is inflation. At the same time that the supply remains the same or shrinks in size. The price is pushed up, so more money is needed to buy the same items as before. It's quite rough, hey? Those who were clever enough or had the money to take advantage of low prices before the prices went up for inflation are the only ones who benefited from inflation. Government can also inflate the money supply. They do this by printing more money. If prices continue to skyrocket, hyperinflation can occur. This is how the purchasing power of people's money reduces, so that they can buy far less even with a lot more money than they used to. To use our original example of bubblegums, your grandmother could have bought 40 bubblegums with $2 in the 1900s, whereas your $2 buy you just one. The inflation has increased 40-fold since that time. Or the 3 coins that bought you 3 bread rolls last week now buy you only 2. I don't like inflation. In economic terms, the 2 main causes of inflation are cost-push inflation and demand-pull inflation. Let's learn more about this push and pull inflation business. The first cause of inflation is what economists call cost-push inflation. This occurs when prices are pushed up by increases in the cost of production. Since the beginning of the year 2022, a lot of commodity prices in Namibia has been increased. Reasons given were COVID, the war between oil-producing Russia and food-producing Ukraine, and the knock-on effects from these factors such as transportation difficulties and trade embargoes. Namib Mills was among the first food producers to announce a massive price increase on wheat flour, bread, rice, pasta, maize meal, and instant porridge from late April. The company said on NBC News that the price increases were necessitated by rising transportation costs because of higher fuel prices, as well as supply chain disruptions and rising commodity prices. These are all cost push factors causing an increase in price. Price hikes in cooking oil and petroleum were specifically attributed to the war between Russia and Ukraine, leading to limited supply of petroleum worldwide. Of course, higher oil prices and supply disruptions not only bring expensive petrol and diesel for private vehicle owners, but these costs now make the transportation of essential commodities across the border from mainly South Africa more expensive too. Food suppliers will now find it more costly to transport their goods and try to survive themselves by putting the burden of those costs onto their consumers. This is how we got to this situation where the prices of most goods and services have increased lately. Even the prices of utilities such as electricity has gone up, and more increases are imminent. Many of these price increases have the potential to cause cost push inflation. As mentioned earlier, when production costs go up due to higher fuel costs, for example, this causes cost push inflation. Secondly, producers try to meet their customers at their level of ability. So, even salary increases can cause a wage price spiral, where producers also increase prices, feeling that their customers can better afford goods. Increases in raw material costs and fuel also push up prices, as it's currently happening. We can illustrate the trend of cost push inflation with this graph. Here we see how a lower supply of raw aggregate for tarring of roads has led to a higher cost of production of tar, which has pushed up the price of tarring a road. Let's now look at the second cause of inflation. Remember that we said the second cause of inflation is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when prices are pulled up by the increases in demand. We can also say when demand for a product is higher than the availability of such products and services, this drives prices up. We can again use a graph to illustrate demand pull inflation. Here you can see that an increase in, say, coffee demand has caused a rise in the price level from P1 to P2. The rise in consumer demand for coffee could be from consumer boom, meaning people have more spending money, perhaps because of general wage increases, or there is a rise in government spending. Higher business confidence resulting in an increase in investment, or an increase in net exports which brings in foreign currency. Finally, viewers, we have to consider how a rise in inflation influences us, the people. We will look at the consequences of higher inflation on workers, consumers, firms, and the government. The most obvious effect of inflation is that it raises the cost of living. As prices of goods and services go up, consumers have to spend more on overall expenses of housing, food, fuel, healthcare, and so on. For workers, one good effect of inflation is that it tends to drive up wages, because workers see prices climbing and demand better wages to pay their bills. People who get better wages then start spending more, and this increased demand gives companies an incentive to produce more, for which they then need to hire more workers. Businesses in return raise their prices to make up for their higher labor costs, and consumers are willing to pay these higher prices because they have more money in their pockets. Inflation is generally good for the economy as a whole, as people who are working and earning spend more and their spending keeps the economy growing. However, low-income earners and the unemployed always lose out, even when inflation rises. Government employees are also at risk during inflation. Those living on an income that never changes struggle when prices begin to rise faster than they can keep up. The best way to avoid ending up in this situation is not to rely on government benefits as your sole source of income. Inflation is good news for those with debt. As the dollar loses value every year, it also means they eventually pay off less of their debt. Banks know this, and that is why they usually raise interest rates to make up for the falling value of the dollar. For savers, inflation is bad news. Again, especially those who are keeping their money in cash. Because money that's just lying there loses purchasing power. Money should best be invested in a time of inflation, as this offers the best chance for a real long-term return that beats inflation. Viewers, inflation isn't all good or bad. It drives up prices and reduces the purchasing power of your savings, but it also drives up wages and typically boosts economic growth. That's good for investors and for the economy as a whole. Winners in an inflationary environment are investors, debtors, and wage earners who can negotiate for higher salary. Savers, creditors, and anyone living on a fixed income tend to fall behind during inflation. That has brought us to the end of today's lesson. We have been discussing what inflation is. Inflation is the persistent rise in prices. Inflation is caused by cost-push inflation and demand-pull inflation. Next time, we'll be discussing balance of payments. See you then.